I'm very pleased to be back here in Budapest for these OpenStack Days. I've been to several of them, and it's always a great experience. It's a lovely city. It's people are actually nicer here than in Paris, and the wine is almost as good, so, you know. So Jonathan just mentioned the new strategy that we adopted for the OpenStack Foundation over the past 6 months, and went into a lot of details in there. And I wanted to go back in time and tell the story of how we came to do that strategic change, like explain where it comes from, why we did it, and the consequences for the OpenStack project, for the OpenStack Foundation. First, back in 2017, last year, we had a number of parallel discussions that all pointed to a similar need for change. And you have to remember that OpenStack started with a very strong project focus. It was solely focused on the production of OpenStack software, to the point where the community was actually defined by the software that we produced. That was actually reinforced by the project structural reform we did in 2015 called the Big Tent, which basically said that everything that is produced by our community is a part of OpenStack by definition. And that was really excellent initially to build a community from scratch, to capture all the excitement that existed around the OpenStack project and grow to the size that we are today. But by 2017, it was pretty clear that we are hitting the limits of that system. Being project-centric has a number of drawbacks. One of them is that it's very isolationist. Everything happens within your community. Everything you care is your community. So it makes it more difficult to cooperate with adjacent communities or to reuse pieces of technology that are produced by adjacent communities. But the main issue really was that it created a lot of confusion as to what OpenStack is. Turns out that whatever your community produces is not a great product definition. And so we had a leadership meeting in March of 2017 in Boston with the technical committee, the user committee, the board of directors, the OpenStack Foundation staff, to try to come up with strategic issues that we needed to work on. And one of them was to better communicate what is OpenStack. It was one of the 5 areas that we identified as needing some work. And as a result, we started working on a map, which Jonathan showed earlier. This map shows clearly what is the main OpenStack product. It's this set of services you can deploy to build a cloud infrastructure, and that's the central part of the graph, of that diagram. But you also have add-on tooling that you can add to that to facilitate operations. You also have a set of recipes or tools that you can use to deploy that product. Or you have a set of tools that you can deploy as an end user of those clouds to actually consume them. Or you have a set of tools that are actually bridges between other technology stacks to get into OpenStack. And representing that in that diagram, rather than this long list of components, really helped us get clarity about what the main OpenStack product is, which is the central box here. So we can see what belongs in it and what does not really fit well in it. Another parallel discussions we had around the same time was around our continuous integration system. Everyone agrees that one thing we really did really well in OpenStack is building continuous integration in from day 0. And as OpenStack grew, that system really evolved with it to the very powerful system that we're using today. And yet, nobody else was using it. It was a sad story of a really great tool that only the OpenStack community was using because it was operating behind the scenes. And so we wanted to find ways to expose that to a larger number of people. Yet another discussion we had around the same time in 2017 is a demand for more. We saw a number of open source projects, interesting open source projects, or organizations that were interested in openly collaborating, coming to the OpenStack Foundation because they liked how we supported the OpenStack project and they loved our principles. And the only answers we had was either make them a part of OpenStack and by doing that, further diluting what we meant by OpenStack, or say no. And there was lots of great technology that we could not properly support with this very binary approach to supporting projects. Another thing that happened around the same time as well was the same organizations that were helping us build this great cloud infrastructure framework called OpenStack were also interested in exploring new models that were beyond the traditional data center cloud model, more towards a more distributed infrastructure model, in particular edge computing, which is about putting cloud compute resources closer to where they are consumed to enable lower latency applications like augmented reality and other needs. And while OpenStack is a perfect match for some of those needs, it's not enough. So how do we fix that? How do we help those organizations going forward? And finally, the last discussion that happened around the same time as well that really signaled to me a need for a change is discussing with our users. See how they were mixing and matching open technologies to solve their infrastructure needs, and how difficult that integration was. How they had to reinvent everything from scratch all the time. How they were suffering from lack of end-to-end testing, or lack of stronger ties between those various technologies that they were integrating. It really pointed to integration being the last mile of in further open infrastructure adoption. So at that point, we knew we had to change something, but we also wanted to make sure that we stayed true to our roots. So we took that step back and looked at our original motivation. Why did we get into this game 7 years ago? Why did we start OpenStack in the beginning? At the very start of OpenStack, there is this strong belief that to build really successful technology, open source is not enough. You also need to do open collaboration. And by open collaboration, I mean an open source project where anyone, any individual, any organization can participate as equals on a level playing field without any single organization holding the keys to the kingdom. It's the only way to attract sufficient contribution and sufficient adoption to create really great technology. The other strong belief at the start of OpenStack is the belief in open infrastructure. The belief that we do not want a world where every infrastructure needs are provided by a couple of internet giants. There is a need for an open source solution enabling anyone to access that technology. So those are the two strong beliefs that we wanted to preserve. We also built an open source foundation where we recognize the importance of both the upstream and the downstream work. Some foundations are really good at upstream work, which is supporting development teams, healthy development communities, software development. Some foundations are really good at the downstream stuff, which is around marketing, creating events, engaging with users, making sure there is a marketplace of products around the open source technology that you promote. And we really wanted to strike a balance between those two, have both expertise, and realize that one cannot be truly successful without the other. And finally, we strongly believe that we need to keep having fun. It's an ambitious mission. We're facing very large organizations that are really strong in their markets, have billions of dollars in their pockets, and we had to remember to not take it too seriously and remember to have fun along the way. And I think the moment we stop having fun, we'll probably stop doing it. So after reminding ourselves of that original motivation, we also needed to look back at what happened over the past 7 years, what we built, and we should definitely reuse, beyond just the OpenStack software. We created a coalition of organizations rallied around that idea of openly collaborating to build open infrastructure. Could be competitors to the big 3 cloud providers trying to create an alternate public cloud provider. Could be retail or entertainment companies not really interested in funding their own extinction by financing Amazon Web Services' huge margins and let Amazon take over their business in the end. Could be public research organizations like CERN who could not afford to run their mind-boggling compute needs on a public cloud. Could be organizations in Europe or China that have data sovereignty laws or concerns with privacy that are not really happy with putting all their data in US-based providers. We also built a network of events. We're here at an OpenStack Day. We also run OpenStack summits that are more global. We encourage local meetups. We run project teams gathering to get people to collaborate on the software. And collectively, those events reach out to 20,000 people every year. And whatever we do, we should make sure to reuse that footprint of events that we created. We also fostered a great user community, engaged and willing to share their experiences. Whatever we do, we should make sure to continue leveraging that. And finally, we built a project infrastructure, an openly operated set of open source services that are in service of building the OpenStack project, and we should really make sure that we reuse that. So after going back to this original motivation and taking stock of what we built that we should definitely reuse, we came up with this new strategy, which is basically a discussion shift from being project-focused, project-oriented, creating a solution, building software, building OpenStack, to a goal-oriented discussion, like solving a problem space, integrating solutions to solve that problem space, building open infrastructure rather than open infrastructure solutions rather than just OpenStack. And that's what was presented in Sydney and what Jonathan presented earlier, shifting the discussion to be goal-oriented by going through those 4 integration steps. And we apply that recipe to specific open infrastructure areas that we think are strategic and which we call the focus areas. So we define 4 complementary focus areas: data center cloud, which is the traditional problem space that OpenStack is solving. Another problem space that we wanted to explicitly explore was around edge computing. If you want to push lots of micro deployments closer to where compute resources are consumed, they will need to be interoperable. They will need to be to use some kind of standard solution, and we think open source has a great role to play there. The third one is container infrastructure. To truly integrate containers in an open infrastructure environment, you need to look at it from bare metal up to the container orchestration solutions with an eye towards security. And looking at it end to end, you can see some missing pieces and some need for end-to-end testing, and that's what this focus area is about. The last one is continuous integration and continuous deployment, going from code being written by developers to services being consumed by users, and how to facilitate that. Those 4 focus areas are highly complementary. In particular, you will notice that OpenStack is reused in all of those in one way or another. The key difference is that OpenStack is no longer the end goal. It's just a means to an end. You will also notice that focus areas are at various stages in that cycle. For example, OpenStack is more around phase 3 and phase 4, where we build the required new technology and we are more looking into integrating testing end to end. The edge focus area is more between 1 and 2, where we are still working to identify common use cases and look for technology to help with solving that problem. Container infrastructure, we're heavily collaborating across communities, and we're starting to look like Kata containers to build the required missing pieces to support that. So I won't get back into the various pieces of software that we ended up creating to support that. The most visible piece is obviously the project, but it's just a visible piece of the iceberg, and it's really, you have to think of it as more of a continuum of efforts between fostering discussions, initial discussions to define those use cases, collaborating across communities, reaching out to see what's out there that could be reused, look at creating new open collaboration grounds for building the required new technology whenever it's required, and at the end, testing everything end to end. So there are lots of questions on the consequences of that strategy. There is a lot of fear that it means dilution or moving away from OpenStack and supporting an OpenStack project. So I wanted to take a few minutes to go through the consequences. For the foundation, obviously that means that we support more than just OpenStack, which creates interesting branding issues because obviously the OpenStack Foundation is named the OpenStack Foundation. We also probably will need to look into the OpenStack Foundation bylaws because they're very OpenStack centric, and rewrite some of the pieces there to make sure that it's more about supporting open infrastructure in general rather than only supporting the creation of the OpenStack project. It also creates interesting internal organization challenges to help us better support those various focus areas rather than the traditional upstream, downstream approach that we had internally. For the OpenStack project, like I said, there's lots of fear about what that means for OpenStack project, but the reality is it doesn't change much. OpenStack is still the central piece of our open infrastructure strategy. It's really the base for open infrastructure software. If anything, my hope is that it will create less distraction, with less distraction from the various projects that want it to be part of OpenStack. We'll have this opportunity to focus and refine what we actually mean by OpenStack. If we don't have to call everything we do OpenStack, we have that opportunity to be more opinionated about what OpenStack is and what OpenStack is not. And I think that focus will really help with the work we are doing on the upstream side. We should also see more and more reusable components because, as I said, OpenStack components are reused in those various focus areas. And we're seeing that having more and more reusable components individually within OpenStack helps us reuse those components in those various focus areas. For our project infrastructure, there are also fears that by separating it from the OpenStack project, by creating the Zool project separately from OpenStack, that would mean dilution of resources as well. Obviously, the consequence is that our project infrastructure will serve more than just OpenStack, which means that we need to work on the governance of the infrastructure so that it's not a sub-project of OpenStack, but it's a project of its own. It's always been the case that our infrastructure supported more than OpenStack, but it was more like hidden behind the scene. Like we had StackForge before, and everyone could create an open source project hosted on our project infrastructure, but that was not really well known or anything. Now it will be something we will promote more heavily. And we hope to see new resources being invested in it by virtue of being used for other communities than just OpenStack. And so we hope that more people will be interested in participating to the project infrastructure once it gets its own identity. The last thing I wanted to address is the fear that those new projects means a dilution of our principles. For example, we give new projects much more freedom as to what language they're using, what programming language they're using, what tooling they're using. For example, Kata containers is developed on GitHub, while the OpenStack project had a pretty strong stance against proprietary development platforms. So there is this fear that it means that anything goes, like, well, you can do anything now. Where are the red lines exactly? And I think the red lines are the 4 opens. It really defines the way we do open source at the OpenStack Foundation. So open source, which means that everything we do is under an open source license. There is no open core. We don't really support or encourage the production of enterprise versions above the software. Should be self-sufficient. Open development, everything that happens in development is transparent. You can see it happening. You can participate. Anyone can participate in code reviews, in proposing code. We do open design, which means that it's not a separate group of developers that meet behind closed doors that define the future of the software. It's actually done in our OpenStack summits, in the forum where we discuss with all the community what we're doing next. And finally, open community, which means that contribution is our only currency. The projects are governed by the contributors to the project. There is no appointed seats. It should ultimately be driven by the contributors to the project. We also have basic governance laws. We want technical governance to follow a number of basic rules. It should be contributor-driven bodies, like I said. We also want to limit the number of bodies. We don't want like vanity governance bodies just for people that want a title. Only make governance bodies where decisions are actually made. And we also need to make sure that it's strongly aligned with the constituency. And that's why we do not have like a top technical committee above all the OpenStack Foundation hosted projects, because since those are disjoint communities, that would mean that the smaller project would be governed by the larger projects. So we separate governance bodies so that the contributors, if they're in separate groups, the contributors get represented by people that they elect rather than suffer from being integrated in a larger role. And finally, we are not really interested in grabbing every interesting project out there. It's not like anything goes. We need to be able to paint an overarching complementarity story between them. Make sure that those projects work well together, and we really try to encourage those synergies between the projects. Like I said, it's different communities, different groups, so it's a bit of a work to get them to talk together and make sure that those projects work really well. But I think it's really important for us to make sure that that those projects work better together rather than are completely separate and are not really collaborating. That's it. I'll be here all day, so if you have questions about that, doubts about the strategy that we followed, please come to me. And I think now is a coffee break and then the CERN keynote, which I encourage you to follow. And so have a great day and have a good time with OpenStack.